The Cistercians are a really good example of people whose rhetoric was all about going back to what was old, but actually it's something completely new and completely Cistercian.
The traditional Cistercian landscape, of course, it has to be wild, because their idea is to go into the desert, really emulating Christ in the desert and St. John the Baptist in the desert, to live a much more ascetic, simple, spiritual life.
They consciously wanted to reform their chant. They wanted the original, correct Roman chant, and they thought that the best way of doing that was to go back to the source. And so they went back to what they considered the source, which was Metz. But when they got to Metz, they found that Metz just sang the same kind of chant as everybody. They didn't seem to have this original, wonderful Gregorian chant themselves. So they then said, well, we're obviously going to have to put a helping hand in here. And they prayed very hard, and then they revised the chants to make them much more simple.
The chief monastic musical officer of the community is the precentor, and the precentor also was the officer charged with the general supervision of the scriptorium. So, in a sense, the development of the monastery's musical traditions and its progress as a centre of book production went hand in hand.
In the Middle Ages, they believed that there was a particular hierarchy in heaven, there is a hierarchy on earth. In heaven you would have God, you would have archangels, and likewise this hierarchy is recreated on the layout of the page. So you may have a big capital letter, you may have a smaller one, you may have a nice bright colour at the top, lesser colourful ones later on.
A very good example of this is to take the opening line of John's Gospel, where you see the first words of that opening line occupy the entire page of that section of the manuscript.
When you look at the layout of the page, often you see a great band of white space around it. It was giving space for someone else to write notes in the margin around the text. And so the larger text in the centre is actually the text from the book of Isaiah, and the smaller is the commentary on it.
The monks that come to Tintern have come from a background, if you like, of a wild countryside that they're expected to tame and to turn into usable land. So somebody, I suspect, would come to the donor's land at Tintern and decide, yeah, this is the best site, and if we put it there, we can dig a channel off the Wye, bring it through the buildings to drain the toilets, supply the kitchens, all that sort of thing, and that will determine how you lay the cloister out and on which side the church goes. So in the case of Tintern, it meant building the church on the south side of the cloister and the cloister on the north side in order to get the water through. There's almost a space in every bit of the monastery for each activity. The cloisters are where the work's done, the chapter house is where the administration's done, the church is where the Opus Dei, the work of God type work is carried on, the refectory is where you eat. It's all in that very small space, really.
There's also the psychological space that these chants take up, because they were, in the Middle Ages, intended for prayer and for meditation. We're so used now to spoken religious services, but in the Middle Ages, in monasteries, singing was what they did all day, every day. The first thing they did was to learn all the psalms off by heart, and they didn't learn to say the psalms, they learned to sing the psalms.
The monk will know that the opening of John's Gospel is, in the beginning was the Word, before he opens the book. And so there's no need for the scribe to produce something which is literally legible, because the purpose here is not to carry the monastic reader as quickly as possible through John's Gospel, but rather to ensure that as he faces the book, he contemplates the deeper meaning of the phrase, in the beginning was the Word.
But for the monk who was creating it, the actual writing, the decoration that they added was all part of their opus dei, the work for God.
You've got a huge, great church at Tintern, and that bears no relationship really to the numbers of people in it. I mean, it's far too big for the number of people in it, really, and it's by no means the biggest.
When you sing, and especially when people sing in community, the way that you fill that architectural space then has unity to it, so that there's a unity in the singing of the monks, and that unity is a prefiguring of the unity that they would experience in heaven. One of the glorious things of actually going to hear a monastery doing the chant is how bad they usually are, because they aren't all singers. They're men with a religious vocation.
Tintern's a bit odd in the cloister's on the north side, which in our climate is a bit of a bummer really, because it means on a day like today you'd be in the shadow and the cold and the wind. You wouldn't have the benefit of the sun at all. But that's probably where most of the work took place, rather than a separate building.